What are you doing? Richard's voice cut through the warm chatter of Christmas dinner, sharp enough that conversations died mid-sentence around my mother's dining room table. I looked up from where I'd just settled into the chair, confused by the edge in his tone, by the way his face had darkened when he'd walked in from the kitchen and seen me sitting there. "I'm sitting down for dinner," I said, keeping my voice even despite the sudden tension crackling in the air, despite the way everyone had gone quiet, forks suspended over plates, all eyes turning toward us. "That's Jessica's seat," Richard said, and something in his expression made my stomach clench. "It's saved for her." I felt heat rise to my cheeks as I glanced around the table at my mother Linda, at her sister Carol and Carol's family, at the other relatives who'd gathered for what was supposed to be a celebration. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize," I started to say, already beginning to rise, already preparing to move to a different seat, even though Jessica had texted an hour ago that she'd be running 2 hours late, and we'd all agreed to start without her. But Richard was already reaching for my chair, his hands gripping the back of it, pulling it backward with enough force that I stumbled as I tried to stand, my hand catching the edge of the table to steady myself. "This seat is for my real daughter," he said, and the words seemed to echo in the sudden silence, each syllable landing like a physical blow. "Get out of it." I stood there frozen, the phrase, real daughter, reverberating through my mind, and I watched my mother's face, waited for her to say something, to intervene, to tell Richard that what he'd just said was cruel and unacceptable. Linda's mouth opened, a small gasp escaping, but she didn't speak, didn't move, just sat there with her napkin clutched in her hands and her eyes wide and helpless. "Richard, that's completely—" Aunt Carol started, her voice sharp with anger, but Richard cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. The humiliation burned through me, hot and suffocating, but I refused to let them see me cry. Refused to give Richard the satisfaction of knowing how deeply those words had cut. I straightened my spine, gathered what remained of my dignity, and looked at him directly. "You're right," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "I should go where I'm actually wanted." I walked away from the table with measured steps, acutely aware of everyone watching, of the thick, uncomfortable silence that followed me as I retrieved my coat from the front closet, as I stepped out into the December cold, where snow was beginning to fall in soft white flakes that caught in my hair and melted on my burning cheeks. Behind me, I heard my mother's voice, weak and ineffectual. "Emma, wait. Please come back. Let's just talk about this." But I didn't turn around, didn't pause, just kept walking toward my car while my hands shook and my vision blurred and something, inside me that had been bending for 15 years, finally, irrevocably, broke. This was it, I realized as I started the engine and pulled away from the house where I'd spent countless holidays, making myself smaller, quieter, less significant so that Richard's real daughter could shine brighter. This was the moment I'd remember as the breaking point, the instant when I stopped waiting for them to see my worth and started demanding it for myself. I was 28 years old, and I'd been the overlooked stepdaughter since I was 13, since the day my mother married Richard and brought his daughter Jessica into our lives, since the day I learned that love in this family was conditional and unequally distributed, and I would always, always come second. I was 13 years old when my mother married Richard, and I remember standing in my new bedroom on moving day, looking at the space that was somehow smaller than the room I'd left behind in our old apartment, while down the hall Jessica, who was 11, squealed with delight over her bedroom that had its own walk-in closet and a window seat overlooking the backyard. From the very beginning, the division was clear, though I told myself it was just because Richard wanted his daughter to feel comfortable in what was technically his house, that it didn't mean anything, that things would even out once we all adjusted to being a blended family. But things never evened out. Jessica got new furniture for her room while I kept my childhood bed with the chipped paint, got first choice of the bathroom schedule even though I was older, got the computer in her room while I had to use the one in the family space where everyone could see what I was doing. When I made honor roll that first semester, my mother smiled and put the certificate on the refrigerator for a day before it disappeared. But when Jessica passed her math test with a C+ after weeks of tutoring, Richard took us all out to dinner to celebrate and gave a toast about perseverance and dedication. I learned to stay quiet, to not point out the inequities, to convince myself that if I was just patient and understanding and undemanding, eventually they would see me, would value me the way they valued Jessica. My high school graduation should have been one of the proudest days of my life. Graduating in the top 10% of my class with a scholarship to State University. But I remember looking out into the audience after receiving my diploma and seeing Richard checking his watch, and halfway through the ceremony, he leaned over and whispered to my mother that they needed to leave early to get to Jessica's soccer game across town, and I watched them slip out during another student's speech, missing the scholarship's announcement, missing everything that actually mattered. When I got my college acceptance letter with a full academic scholarship, my mother planned a small celebration dinner. But 2 days before, Jessica decided she wanted to have friends over for her 15th birthday party that same evening. And my mother asked me in that careful, placating voice if we could maybe postpone my celebration just a week or two, just to make things easier since the party was already planned. And I said yes because I always said yes. Because making waves meant being difficult, and being difficult meant being even less loved than I already was. That postponed celebration never happened. The pattern continued through college, through every achievement I worked so hard to earn. When I graduated with honors, Richard scheduled a fishing trip that same weekend, and my mother went with him while Jessica claimed she had work commitments she couldn't miss. And I walked across that stage, knowing no one who shared my blood was watching. When I signed the lease on my first apartment after college, my mother promised to come see it, to help me unpack and settle in. But the morning she was supposed to arrive, she called to say that Jessica needed help moving her things between dorm rooms, and could we reschedule, and I spent that day alone unpacking boxes and telling myself it didn't hurt, that I didn't need them, that I was used to this by now. The professional divide between Jessica and me couldn't have been more stark, though you wouldn't know it from how the family talked about our respective careers at holiday gatherings and birthday dinners, where Richard would hold court about Jessica's impressive position in commercial real estate, while my work was dismissed as a nice little hobby I did from home. I had put myself through State University studying architecture, working 3 jobs simultaneously to graduate without debt, spending nights in the studio perfecting designs while my classmates slept, earning honors and faculty recommendations and a reputation for innovative, sustainable design that landed me my first real clients before I even had my diploma in hand. Jessica, by contrast, had attended Thornton Private University where tuition ran $65,000 a year, fully funded by Richard, who never once asked if I needed help with my state school expenses. And she'd changed majors 4 times over 5 years, starting with business, then switching to marketing, then communications, then finally settling on something called integrated media studies that seemed to require more socializing than actual coursework. She'd graduated with mediocre grades and no clear direction, spent 6 months finding herself on a European trip that Richard also funded, and then landed a position at Richard's commercial real estate firm as a client relations coordinator, a title that sounded impressive, but was clearly a job created specifically for her, with a salary I suspected was far more than her minimal responsibilities warranted. I was a freelance architect specializing in sustainable residential design, working from my modest 1-bedroom apartment that doubled as my office, taking on projects that ranged from eco-friendly home renovations to small-scale community housing developments, building a reputation slowly and carefully through word of mouth and a growing portfolio of work I was genuinely proud of. But at family dinners, Richard would talk about Jessica's career with the kind of pride that made it clear he considered her the successful one, dropping comments about how she worked for a real company with benefits and stability, how she had an office downtown with her name on the door, how she was learning the business from the ground up, even though everyone knew she'd been handed that position without having to compete for it or prove herself qualified. My freelance work was treated as somehow less legitimate, less real, a temporary situation I was in until I got a proper job with a proper company, and when I tried to talk about my projects, Richard would nod politely and change the subject, or worse, offer unsolicited advice about how I should really consider applying to established firms, instead of trying to make it on my own. I'd learned not to correct their assumptions about my income or the caliber of my clients, learned not to mention when I landed a significant project or received recognition in industry publications, because past experience had taught me that my achievements made them uncomfortable, created a dissonance they resolved by diminishing what I'd accomplished rather than reconsidering their assessment of my worth. What they didn't know, what I hadn't told anyone in the family, was that for the past 18 months, I'd been working on something that would change everything, something that made Jessica's handed down position look like exactly what it was, and I'd kept it secret not out of modesty, but out of exhaustion, with their inability to see me clearly, their determination to cast me as the struggling stepdaughter who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention they threw my way. I arrived at my mother's house at 11 in the morning on Christmas Day, pulling up to the familiar colonial with the wreath on the door and the lights Richard had strung along the roofline with his usual precision. And I sat in my car for a moment, looking at the bags of gifts in my passenger seat, thoughtful presents I'd spent weeks selecting and wrapping, a cashmere scarf in my mother's favorite shade of blue, a first edition book for Richard about architectural history because I kept trying to find common ground we'd never actually established, and for Jessica, a beautiful leather portfolio I thought she might use at work, each gift chosen with care, even though past experience had taught me that the effort was rarely reciprocated or even noticed. I carried everything inside, calling out a greeting as I entered, and my mother appeared from the kitchen wearing the apron I'd given her last year, her face already showing signs of stress as she kissed my cheek distractedly and said that Jessica was running late, that she'd texted saying she might not arrive until 2 or 3, and I saw the flicker of anxiety in my mother's eyes that I'd learned to recognize as her fear that something wouldn't be perfect for Richard and his daughter. Richard himself barely glanced up from where he was arranging bottles in the dining room, giving me a perfunctory nod before returning his attention to the table he was setting with what I recognized as the good china that only came out for special occasions, place cards already positioned at each seat in his neat handwriting. And when he saw me looking, he said that he wanted everything to be nice for when Jessica arrived, as if the hours before her arrival were just a preamble to the real celebration that would begin when she walked through the door. I set down my bags and asked what I could do to help, falling into the familiar pattern of making myself useful. And for the next 3 hours, I peeled potatoes and stirred gravy and set out appetizers and folded napkins, while my mother directed me with the kind of detailed instructions she never seemed to need to give Jessica. And when Aunt Carol arrived with her husband Tom and their 2 teenagers, she pulled me into a warm hug and told me I looked beautiful and asked about my work with genuine interest, though I noticed that even she moderated her warmth toward me when Richard was in the room, as if his assessment of my worth in this family was contagious, and everyone had unconsciously agreed to treat me as slightly less important than I should have been. By the time the table was fully set, and the food was ready, and the house smelled like pine and cinnamon and roasting turkey, I walked past the dining room and noticed the place cards arranged along the table, and I saw that Richard and my mother were seated at the center with Jessica's card placed between them in the position of honor, while my card was at the far end near Aunt Carol's teenagers, physically separated from the family core, in a way that was probably unintentional, but felt like a perfect metaphor for every Christmas and birthday and holiday I'd experienced in this house for the past 15 years. I stood there looking at that arrangement of names, and I told myself the same thing I always told myself, that it didn't matter where I sat, that making an issue of it would just cause tension and mark me as difficult and overly sensitive, that the mature thing to do was to accept the seat I'd been given and be grateful I was included at all, and I turned away from the table and went back to the kitchen to help my mother with the final preparations, swallowing down the familiar hurt and promising myself I'd just get through this day the way I'd gotten through all the others. At 2:15, my mother made the decision that we should go ahead and start dinner. Since Jessica had texted again saying she was still at least an hour away, stuck in traffic coming back from her boyfriend's family gathering in the suburbs, and everyone began moving toward the dining room with that particular energy of a holiday meal that's been delayed too long, hunger mixing with forced cheerfulness, and the desire to just get on with things. I followed along with Aunt Carol and her family, looking at that place card at the far end of the table with my name on it, and I made a split-second decision that felt both rebellious and utterly reasonable, which was to sit in one of the empty middle seats since Jessica wasn't here yet anyway. And there was no point in having 3 empty chairs at the center of the table while we all crowded at the ends. So I pulled out the chair that was 2 seats down from my mother and sat down, smoothing my napkin across my lap and reaching for the water glass that had been set at that place. Richard entered from the kitchen carrying a serving platter of sliced turkey, and I saw the exact moment he registered where I was sitting because his entire face changed, a darkness crossing his expression that I'd seen before but never quite directed at me with this particular intensity. And he set the platter down with enough force that the china rattled and said, "What are you doing?" I looked up at him, confused by the edge in his voice, and said, "I'm sitting down for dinner," which seemed like an obvious answer to an obvious question, but his jaw tightened and he gestured sharply at the chair I was occupying and said, "That's Jessica's seat. It's saved for her." I felt heat rise to my cheeks as everyone's attention turned toward us, the conversation dying away into uncomfortable silence, and I said quickly, trying to diffuse whatever this was becoming, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. I can move, it's not a problem." And I started to stand up, but Richard was already moving toward me, his hand reaching for the back of my chair, and he pulled it backward with enough force that I stumbled, catching myself on the edge of the table, and his voice cut through the room with perfect clarity as he said, "This seat is for my real daughter. Get out of it." The words seemed to echo in the sudden absolute silence, hanging in the air like something physical and sharp, and I stood there frozen as the meaning of what he'd just said settled over everyone at the table, over me most of all, those 3 words, my real daughter, branding themselves into my consciousness, and clarifying in one crystalline moment exactly what I was in this family, and exactly what I would always be. My mother gasped, a small intake of breath that might have been shock or dismay, but she didn't speak, didn't contradict him, didn't rush to tell him that I was her daughter too, and that what he'd just said was cruel and unacceptable, and her silence felt like its own kind of statement, its own form of agreement with his assessment of my place in this family hierarchy. Aunt Carol half rose from her seat, her face flushed with anger, and she started to say, "Richard, that's completely—" But he cut her off with a sharp gesture and said, "This is my house and my table, and I'll arrange my family as I see fit." And I realized with perfect clarity that there was no coming back from this moment, no way to unsay what had been said or unknow what I now knew about how he saw me and how my mother was willing to let him see me. I straightened up, pulling together every shred of dignity I possessed, and I looked at Richard with a calmness I didn't entirely feel, and said quietly, "You're right, I should go where I'm actually wanted." And then I turned and walked out of the dining room, hearing my mother's voice calling weakly after me, "Emma, wait, please don't go, we can work this out." But I kept walking through the living room to the front closet where I grabbed my coat, and I walked out the front door into the shocking cold of the December afternoon, into the silence of falling snow, and I didn't look back. I drove through the Christmas evening streets with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, the snow falling heavier now and blurring the streetlights into soft halos of gold that I could barely see through the tears I was refusing to let fall. And I made the 15-minute drive to my apartment in the older part of downtown where I'd lived for the past 3 years, in a modest 1-bedroom that I'd decorated myself and filled with my drafting table and my books and the quiet life I'd built away from their judgment. I parked in my assigned spot and sat there for a moment in the silence after I turned off the engine, and that's when the shaking really started. my whole body trembling with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Not anger exactly, and not just hurt, but something deeper and more fundamental, like a foundation cracking after years of bearing weight it was never meant to carry. I went inside and didn't bother turning on the lights, just stood in my dark living room still wearing my coat with snow melting into the shoulders, and the phrase kept echoing in my head with perfect clarity: "This seat is for my real daughter." And I understood with sudden piercing insight that this was never going to change, that I could spend another 15 years trying to earn a place at that table, and I would always be the one pushed aside, always be tolerated rather than embraced, always be less than Jessica, in ways that had nothing to do with my actual worth, and everything to do with decisions my mother had made about whose comfort mattered more. My phone started buzzing in my pocket, and I pulled it out to see the messages flooding in. First from my mother saying, "Please come back, you're being too sensitive. Richard didn't mean it that way." Which was so predictable it almost made me laugh, except that nothing about this felt funny, just crushing and final and clarifying in a way I'd been avoiding for years. Aunt Carol texted, "I'm so sorry. That was unconscionable. Are you okay? Call me when you're ready." And her message was the only one that acknowledged what had actually happened, instead of trying to reframe it as my overreaction or my failure to understand. I sat down on my couch, still in my coat, and watched the messages come in. My mother sending 3 more variations of the same theme: that I was making too much of this, that family means forgiving and moving past uncomfortable moments, that I should come back tomorrow and we'd all talk it through like adults. And every message made it clearer that she genuinely couldn't see what she'd allowed to happen or what she'd been allowing to happen for 15 years. Then, around 8 o'clock, a text came through from Jessica that said, "Heard there was drama. Hope you're not making Mom's Christmas about you again." And something in me went very still and very calm as I read those words, the casual cruelty of them, the assumption that my hurt was really just attention-seeking, and I realized that I was done, completely and finally done seeking approval or understanding or basic human dignity from people who had never intended to give it to me. I set down my phone and walked to my desk where my laptop sat closed, and I opened it and pulled up my email and scrolled to the message I'd received 3 days ago, 3 days before Christmas. The message I'd been afraid to answer because answering it would mean admitting that I deserved more than what this family had decided I was worth. And I read it again in the glow of the screen, Marcus Westfield's formal offer of partnership, and I knew with absolute certainty what I was going to do next. The email from Marcus Westfield had arrived 3 days before Christmas, on December 22nd at 11:47 in the morning, and I'd read it standing in my kitchen with my coffee going cold in my hand, reading it 3 times to make sure I was understanding correctly what he was offering me. And even then, I'd been afraid to believe it was real, or that I deserved it, or that accepting wouldn't somehow prove to be a mistake that would unravel everything I'd been building for the past 18 months. What Marcus didn't know, what my family didn't know, what I'd kept carefully private because I'd learned over years of having my achievements minimized, that sometimes the safest thing is to stay quiet about success until it's undeniable, was that for a year and a half, I'd been the lead architect on Verde Heights, a revolutionary eco-housing development project that had started as a consultation job and had become the most significant work of my career. Westfield and Associates, one of the most prestigious architectural firms in the Midwest, with a 40-year history of award-winning, sustainable design, had brought me on initially to provide some technical drawings for a mid-sized residential development their client was planning. But when I'd seen the preliminary plans, I'd realized they were thinking too small, too conventional, missing an opportunity to create something genuinely transformative. And I'd spent 2 weeks of my own time developing an alternative vision that incorporated passive solar design, rainwater harvesting systems, green roofs, shared community spaces that would reduce individual unit sizes while increasing quality of life, and a modular construction approach that would make the whole development replicable and scalable. I'd presented my alternative design to Marcus, expecting him to politely dismiss it as too ambitious or too risky, but instead, he'd stared at the renderings for a long time and then looked up at me and said, "This is exactly what sustainable housing should be, and nobody's been brave enough to build it. Let's do this." And suddenly, I wasn't a consultant anymore, but the creative lead on a project that would eventually include 240 residential units, become a model for eco-friendly urban development, and win the National Sustainable Architecture Award, which was one of the highest honors in the field and something I'd dreamed about since graduate school, but never imagined achieving at 28. The award ceremony was scheduled for January 10th in Chicago, just 2 weeks away, and I'd received the notification about winning back in November, but had told no one in my family because I'd learned through painful experience that they didn't actually care about my achievements, that Richard would find some way to diminish it or redirect attention to Jessica's far less impressive accomplishments, that my mother would offer tepid congratulations while clearly not understanding the significance, and that the whole thing would leave me feeling smaller rather than celebrated. The email from Marcus that I was reading again now in the darkness of my apartment on Christmas night was offering me something beyond the award, something I'd been too afraid to hope for, which was a full partnership in Westfield and Associates, making me the youngest partner in the firm's history, with a starting salary of $340,000 plus equity, and the opportunity to lead the sustainable design division from their Chicago office. And the only reason I hadn't immediately accepted was that some part of me had still been tied to this city by the idea of family obligation, by the belief that maybe if I stayed close and kept trying, I could eventually earn the place at the table that should have been mine by right. But sitting there with Richard's words still echoing in my head, "This seat is for my real daughter," I understood with perfect clarity that I'd been waiting for something that was never going to come, that the only approval I needed was my own, and that Marcus Westfield's offer wasn't just a job, but permission to finally stop making myself small to accommodate people who had never intended to make room for me anyway. Aunt Carol knocked on my apartment door at 10 o'clock the morning after Christmas, and when I opened it, she pulled me into a fierce hug before I could even say hello, holding on longer than usual, and I could feel her shaking slightly with what I realized was anger, the protective fury of someone who'd witnessed an injustice and spent the night thinking about it. "I left right after you did," she said when she finally released me and came inside, shrugging off her coat. "I told Richard exactly what I thought of his behavior, and I told your mother she should be ashamed of herself, and then I gathered my family, and we left because I wasn't going to sit there and pretend that what happened was acceptable. I made coffee and we sat at my small kitchen table, and something about her presence, about having a witness who actually saw what had happened and wasn't trying to reframe it as my oversensitivity, made me feel less alone than I had in years. "I'm done, Aunt Carol," I said quietly. "I'm done trying to earn a place in a family that's never going to give it to me." She reached across the table and took my hand and said, "Good, it's about damn time." And there was such conviction in her voice that I felt something loosen in my chest. And then, because she was the one person in my family who'd ever really seen me, I told her everything about Verde Heights and the National Sustainable Architecture Award and Marcus Westfield's partnership offer, watching her face transform from surprise to astonishment to fierce pride as I explained what I'd been working on for 18 months, what I'd accomplished, what I'd been offered. $340,000, she repeated, stunned. "Emma, that's extraordinary. Why didn't you tell anyone?" And I explained what I'd learned over 15 years, that my achievements were threats rather than celebrations, that sharing success meant watching it be minimized or redirected, that I'd taught myself to stay quiet, to avoid the pain of having something I was proud of treated as less important than Jessica's mediocre accomplishments. Carol's eyes filled with tears, and she said something that hit me like a physical blow. "You've been living small so they don't feel bad about treating you small." And I realized she was exactly right, that I'd been managing their comfort at the expense of my own dignity, shrinking myself to fit into the tiny space they'd allocated for me. She told me I had to take the partnership, had to move to Chicago, had to build the life I deserved away from people who'd never learned to value me. Then she told me something I hadn't known, that years ago, when I was maybe 17 or 18, she'd confronted my mother directly about the differential treatment, about how obvious it was that Richard favored Jessica, and that Linda was allowing it, and my mother had defended the dynamic, had said that Emma needed to understand that Richard's relationship with Jessica was different because Jessica was his biological daughter, and not take it personally, had essentially argued that my hurt feelings were less important than Richard's comfort and Jessica's position. I should have pushed harder, Carol said, her voice breaking slightly. I should have made more noise, should have made her see what she was doing to you, but she kept insisting you were fine, that you understood, and I let myself believe her because it was easier than fighting about it. I told her it wasn't her fault, that my mother had been making active choices for 15 years, that Linda had chosen Richard's comfort over my dignity again and again, and that understanding that she'd been consciously defending this dynamic, rather than just failing to see it change something fundamental in how I understood our relationship, made it clear that this wasn't something that was going to heal with time or patience, but something that would require her to acknowledge what she'd done and choose differently, and I wasn't sure she was capable of that. I called Marcus Westfield on December 27th at 9 in the morning, sitting at my kitchen table with my hands steadier than they'd been in days. And when he answered, I told him I was accepting the partnership offer, that I was ready to move to Chicago in January right after the award ceremony, and I could hear the smile in his voice when he said, "Emma, that's the best news I've heard all week. Welcome to the partnership." And the moment I hung up, I felt something shift inside me, like a weight I'd been carrying for 15 years had suddenly lifted, and I could breathe fully for the first time in my adult life. The decision felt like permission to finally stop waiting for my family's approval, to stop shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold me, to choose my own worth over their conditional acceptance. I spent the next 3 days in a flurry of practical action, calling my landlord to give notice on my apartment, reaching out to my small circle of real friends to tell them about Verde Heights and the partnership and the move to Chicago, and their reactions were everything my family's should have been: genuine excitement and pride and celebration without any undercurrent of resentment or competition. My best friend Sarah actually cried when I told her, saying she'd watched me diminish my accomplishments for years and was thrilled I was finally claiming the success I deserved. I began packing my apartment systematically, wrapping dishes in newspaper, and boxing up books and sorting through years of accumulated belongings, and the physical act of dismantling my life in this city felt cathartic, like I was actively choosing a future rather than passively accepting what had been handed to me. I contacted my current local clients, explaining that I was joining Westfield and Associates and relocating, but would ensure smooth transitions for all ongoing projects. And they were uniformly congratulatory and professional, several mentioning they'd heard of Verde Heights and were impressed by the work. My mother kept calling during those days, leaving voicemails that started apologetic and quickly turned accusatory, saying she didn't understand why I was being so dramatic, that Richard had apologized even though he hadn't actually said the words to me directly, that I needed to come back and talk this through like adults. And then finally demanding that I apologize to Richard for causing a scene and ruining Christmas. And that last message, with its complete inversion of responsibility, made me so angry I blocked her number because I was done being blamed for my own mistreatment. Jessica posted on social media 2 days after Christmas, with photos from the dinner I'd walked out of. Images of her sitting at that middle seat at the table surrounded by family, captioned, "Grateful for perfect family moments and the people who really matter," and the tone deafness of it, the complete lack of awareness that she was celebrating a gathering where I'd been physically pushed aside and called not a real daughter, made me realize she'd never seen me as a person with feelings that mattered, just as an inconvenient presence who occasionally disrupted the narrative of her centrality. I unfollowed her immediately and felt no regret. Everything was falling into place with a clarity I'd never experienced before, and I realized I'd been living in a fog of trying to earn love that should have been freely given, and now that I'd stopped trying, the path forward was obvious. I decided I wouldn't tell my family about the award ceremony or Verde Heights in a phone call or casual conversation, that they needed to see it to believe it, to be confronted with undeniable evidence of the success they'd dismissed, so I began planning an invitation that would make the magnitude of what I'd achieved impossible to ignore. I drafted the email on January 3rd, exactly 1 week before the award ceremony, sitting at my laptop with a cup of coffee going cold beside me and my fingers steady on the keys as I composed something that felt like both an invitation and a reckoning, choosing each word with careful precision because I wanted the tone to be professional and cordial and completely unassailable, wanted them to understand the magnitude of what I'd accomplished without any of the diminishing language I'd trained myself to use over 15 years of making myself smaller. The subject line read, "Professional milestone, your attendance requested," and I addressed it to Linda, Richard, and Jessica, beginning with a formal greeting that felt appropriate for the distance that now existed between us. I am writing to inform you that on January 10th, I will be receiving the National Sustainable Architecture Award for my work as lead architect on Verde Heights, a revolutionary eco-housing development that has been 18 months in development, I wrote. And then I included a link to the project website where my name and photo were prominently featured alongside detailed descriptions of the innovative sustainable design elements I'd created, the environmental impact data, the testimonials from industry experts. I explained that the ceremony would be held at the Drake Hotel in Chicago, provided the specific time and venue details, and stated that I would be honored if they chose to attend, keeping the language gracious but not pleading, an invitation rather than a request for validation. Then, in what I knew would be the paragraph that would truly get their attention, I mentioned almost casually that following the ceremony, I would be relocating to Chicago permanently, as I had accepted a partnership position with Westfield and Associates, and I included the detail that I would be the youngest partner in the firm's 40-year history, because I wanted them to understand this wasn't just a good opportunity, but an exceptional one, the kind of achievement that should have been celebrated loudly if they'd ever actually valued my work. I attached the official award announcement from the National Architecture Foundation and a press release about Verde Heights that had run in Architectural Digest, tangible proof that this was real and significant and not something they could dismiss as my little architecture hobby, the way Richard always had. Before sending it to them, I copied Aunt Carol and her family, and I sent individual emails to my closest friends with a more personal note, expressing how much their support had meant and how much I hoped they could be there to celebrate with me. Then I took a breath and hit send on the email to Linda, Richard, and Jessica, watching it disappear from my outbox, and knowing that in doing so I was forcing a confrontation with reality, making it impossible for them to continue pretending I was the struggling stepdaughter who should be grateful for scraps of attention. My phone sat silent beside me for exactly 7 minutes before it rang with my mother's number, and I let it ring 3 times before I answered, my voice calm and professional when I said hello. The responses over the next few hours revealed everything I needed to know about these relationships and confirmed that I'd made the right choice in planning my exit from their orbit, and I felt nothing but clarity as I watched them scramble to recalibrate their understanding of who I was and what I was worth. Linda called within 7 minutes of my sending the email, and when I answered after letting it ring 3 times, I could hear the confusion and something defensive already forming in her voice when she said, "Emma, I just got your email. Why didn't you tell us about this before?" And I kept my tone perfectly calm and professional as I responded that I hadn't thought they'd be particularly interested given their past responses to my achievements. And there was a beat of silence before she sputtered, "That's not fair. We've always been interested in your work," which was such a blatant rewriting of history that I almost laughed, except I was too focused on maintaining my composure. I heard movement on her end and then Richard's voice in the background asking what was going on, and suddenly he was on the phone, his tone completely different from anything I'd heard from him in 15 years, ingratiating and warm in a way that felt calculated and false, saying, "Emma, this is wonderful news. Really impressive. Of course, we'll be there to support you. You know we've always supported your little architecture hobby. And that phrase, that diminishing little architecture hobby, even in the middle of his attempt at praise, told me everything about how deeply ingrained his dismissal of me was. How even when confronted with a National Sustainable Architecture Award and a partnership offer, he couldn't help but minimize what I'd accomplished. But there was something else in his voice, too. A new awareness, a recalibration happening in real time, as he processed that maybe he'd misjudged my value, that the stepdaughter he'd literally pushed out of a chair 3 weeks ago was actually someone who had achieved something significant, and I could hear him trying to figure out how to position himself in relation to this new information. Linda got back on the phone and asked about the partnership, about the salary, and I gave her the basic details, including the $340,000 starting figure, and heard her sharp intake of breath, and I knew she was doing the math, comparing it to what Richard made, what Jessica made in her created position at his company, and realizing that I was about to be the highest earner in the family, despite being the one they'd always treated as less successful, less stable, less real. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica while I was still on the call with Linda, and after I hung up promising nothing about whether I actually wanted them at the ceremony, I read her message. "Wow, didn't know you had this going on. Congrats, I guess." And the lukewarm response was so typical, so perfectly Jessica, unable to offer genuine enthusiasm or acknowledgement, even when faced with undeniable achievement. And I realized she saw my success as somehow diminishing hers, as if there was only a finite amount of accomplishment available in the family, and my gaining recognition meant she was losing it. Within an hour, Aunt Carol called, and unlike my mother's confused defensiveness or Richard's calculating warmth or Jessica's grudging acknowledgement, Carol was crying happy tears, saying she was so proud of me, and of course she'd be there with her whole family, that she'd been hoping for years I'd finally stop hiding my light to make them comfortable, and her genuine joy felt like water after years of drought. My friends responded to their individual emails with immediate enthusiasm. Sarah and Marcus and Devin all saying they'd be there, that they were planning to make a celebration of it, and their wholehearted support reminded me that I had built a real chosen family over the years, even while I'd been trying desperately to earn love from people who weren't capable of giving it freely. Over the next few days, as the ceremony approached, I watched how each of them continued to respond to this. New information about who I actually was, and every interaction confirmed what I already knew in my bones. Whatever happened at the ceremony in Chicago, I'd already won by reclaiming my narrative, by refusing to keep myself small, by choosing to be seen fully even if being seen meant being rejected, because I was no longer waiting for their approval to know my own worth. I arrived at the Drake Hotel in Chicago on the evening of January 10th at 5:47 p.m., exactly 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. And as I walked through the ornate lobby with its gleaming marble floors and crystal chandeliers, I felt a confidence that was new and solid and entirely my own. Wearing a navy dress I'd purchased specifically for this occasion from a boutique in Chicago during my apartment hunting trip the previous week, the kind of elegant professional outfit I would have once told myself was too expensive or too attention-seeking, but now understood was exactly right for a woman accepting a national award and a partnership that would change the trajectory of her entire life. Marcus Westfield was already in the grand ballroom when I arrived, and he greeted me with genuine warmth, introducing me to colleagues and industry leaders whose names I recognized from architectural publications, treating me not as a junior consultant or a lucky newcomer, but as the respected professional I'd earned the right to be, and I watched how these accomplished people responded to my work when Marcus mentioned Verde Heights, their faces lighting with recognition and respect that had nothing to do with family obligation or conditional approval. My friends Sarah and Marcus and Devin arrived at 6:15, and seeing their familiar faces in this grand, unfamiliar space felt like having anchors in a storm. Though I realized the storm had passed, and what I actually felt was celebration. And they created a warm, protective bubble around me as we stood near the exhibition area where renderings and models of the award-winning projects were displayed, Verde Heights prominent among them, with my name clearly visible as lead architect. Aunt Carol arrived at 6:30 with her husband Tom and their two adult children, and she hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, whispering that she was so proud she could burst. And I saw tears in her eyes as she looked at the Verdi Heights display and then back at me, understanding in a way my mother never had what it meant that I'd achieved this despite having no support from the people who should have championed me loudest. Then at 6:40, I saw them enter the ballroom, Linda in a dress that was slightly too formal and outdated, Richard in a suit that would have been appropriate for his small commercial real estate office, but looked provincial here among the tailored elegance of Chicago's architectural elite, and Jessica in something tight and trendy that seemed designed for a nightclub rather than a professional ceremony, and I watched them take in the space with visible discomfort, their eyes wide as they registered the scale and prestige of the event, the caliber of people in attendance, the undeniable legitimacy of what was happening. Richard immediately began trying to insert himself into conversations near him, and I could hear him from across the room name-dropping his real estate experience to a senior partner from a firm in New York who looked politely confused about who this man was and why he was talking about strip mall developments at an awards ceremony for sustainable residential innovation. Jessica stood slightly apart, checking her phone constantly. Her face set in an expression I recognized as resentment, though I couldn't tell if she was resentful of the attention I was receiving, or resentful that she'd been pressured to attend, or simply resentful of anything that required her to celebrate someone else's achievement. Linda seemed caught in some kind of cognitive dissonance, her gaze moving between the elegant ballroom and the Verde Heights display, and me standing confident among my colleagues. And I could see her trying to reconcile this reality with the mental image she'd carried for 15 years of me as the lesser daughter, the one who should be grateful for inclusion, the one whose modest freelance work from a small apartment was clearly inferior to Jessica's created position in Richard's company. And the reconciliation wasn't going smoothly because the evidence before her eyes was undeniable and overwhelming and completely contrary to the story she'd been telling herself about which daughter had value and which was merely tolerated. The ceremony began at exactly 8 o'clock, when the lights dimmed and Dr. Patricia Ashworth, president of the National Architecture Foundation, took the stage to welcome the audience of nearly 300 architects, developers, urban planners, and industry leaders who had gathered to celebrate innovation in sustainable design. And I sat at my designated table near the front with Marcus Westfield on my right and Sarah on my left, my heart beating steady and strong as I watched several awards presented in categories ranging from historic preservation to urban renewal, each recipient walking to the stage to accept their recognition while video presentations showcased their work. And I could feel Linda and Richard and Jessica somewhere behind me in the audience, could sense their presence like a weight I was about to finally set down. When Dr. Ashworth announced that the next category was Sustainable Residential Design Innovation, describing it as one of the Foundation's most prestigious recognitions given to projects that demonstrated revolutionary approaches to environmental responsibility, combined with exceptional livability and aesthetic achievement, I felt Sarah squeeze my hand and heard Marcus whisper, "This is you," even though I already knew it was coming. Had known since the nomination was announced 3 months ago. But somehow the reality of the moment still felt surreal and enormous and completely deserved all at once. My name rang out through the ballroom speakers, Emma Torres, lead architect for Verde Heights, and immediately the large screens on either side of the stage lit up with footage I'd seen during the editing process, but which still took my breath away. Aerial shots of the Verde Heights development, with its innovative passive solar design and green roof systems, the community gardens and shared courtyards that fostered connection among residents, the net-zero energy homes that proved sustainability and beauty weren't opposing values but complementary ones, and then testimonials from environmental scientists discussing the project's measurable impact on reducing carbon emissions, from residents describing how the design had transformed their quality of life, from the developer explaining how Emma Torres had taken his conventional housing concept and reimagined it as something that could actually help heal the planet rather than harm it. The video emphasized my role not as a minor consultant, but as the creative visionary who had designed every crucial element, who had fought for features that seemed too expensive or too complicated until the data proved their value, who had spent 18 months ensuring that Verda Heights would be exactly what it was, a model for the future of residential architecture. I stood and walked to the stage, aware of every eye on me, aware that somewhere in this room, my mother was watching her supposedly lesser daughter receive national recognition, that Richard was recalculating everything he thought he knew about my worth, that Jessica was confronting the reality that the stepdaughter she'd always dismissed had achieved something she never would. But more important than any of that, I was aware of my own footsteps, my own breath, my own pride that needed no external validation, even as I was about to receive it from the highest authority in my field. Dr. Ashworth handed me the Crystal Award, heavy and solid and engraved with my name and Verdi Heights in the year, and she spoke into the microphone about my visionary approach, about how at 31 I was the youngest recipient in this category's history, about how my work represented not just technical excellence, but moral leadership in an era when architecture had to become part of the climate solution. And then she stepped back, and the microphone was mine, and the room was silent and waiting, and I looked out at 300 faces and began to speak. Thank you to the National Architecture Foundation for this extraordinary honor, I said, my voice steady and clear and amplified throughout the ballroom. And thank you to Marcus Westfield and everyone at Westfield and Associates for trusting me with Verdi Heights, for believing that sustainable design doesn't have to compromise on beauty or community, or the simple joy of coming home to a space that shelters you while honoring the earth. I continued, thanking my project team by name, acknowledging the developers' willingness to take risks, expressing gratitude to the residents who had embraced a new way of living. And then I paused before my final sentence and said, most of all, I'm grateful to those who believed in me when I was still learning to believe in myself, who saw my potential when I couldn't yet see it clearly, who gave me the support that allowed me to take the risks that led to this moment. And I did not look at my mother or Richard or Jessica as I spoke those words, because they were not included in that gratitude. And anyone who knew my story would understand exactly who I was deliberately not thanking. The room erupted in applause that became a standing ovation, and I stood on that stage holding my award, watching 300 people rise to their feet in recognition of work I had done, value I had created, vision I had brought into being. And I finally understood that this was what it felt like to be seen fully and celebrated without reservation and valued for exactly who I was. The reception after the ceremony was held in an adjacent room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Michigan Avenue, elegantly dressed tables offering catered appetizers and champagne, clusters of architects and developers congratulating winners and networking in that easy, confident way successful people have when they know they belong in the space they occupy. And I stood near the bar with my Crystal Award in hand, talking to a senior partner from a firm in San Francisco who wanted to discuss potential collaboration on a commercial project when I felt Richard approach from my left, could sense him before I saw him. That particular energy of someone who wants something from you, but is pretending it's the other way around. Emma, he said with forced joviality that made my skin crawl, his voice too loud for the sophisticated atmosphere. So proud of you. I always knew you had potential. Always told Linda you'd make something of yourself eventually. He reached out as if to hug me or put his arm around my shoulders in that possessive way men claim women's achievements as extensions of their own judgment. I stepped back slightly, just enough that his gesture felt awkward and incomplete, and I looked at him with a calm I had earned through 3 weeks of processing exactly what I wanted to say if this moment came. Did you? I asked, my voice quiet but clear enough that the San Francisco partner and several other nearby people paused in their conversations. Did you always know I had potential? Richard's smile faltered slightly, but he pushed forward. Of course, your family. We've always supported. And I interrupted him with words I'd been holding for 15 years. Richard, 3 weeks ago, you physically pushed me out of a chair at Christmas dinner and told me it was for your real daughter. You made it explicitly clear that I'm not part of your real family. The words hung in the elegant air between us, and I watched his face drain of color as he registered that nearby people had heard. That the San Francisco partner was looking at him with barely concealed disgust. That this moment of attempted glory claiming had just become something else entirely. Emma, that's not. I didn't mean, he stammered. But before he could construct whatever revisionist explanation he was reaching for, Linda appeared at his elbow, her face tight with panic, and she reached for my arm in that pleading way she'd perfected over years of asking me to accommodate Richard's cruelty. Emma, please, not here, you're making a scene, she said in an urgent whisper that was still audible to everyone within 10 feet, and I felt something crystallize in my chest, hard and clear and unbreakable. No, Mom, I said, not whispering, not managing her comfort or protecting her from consequences. For once, I'm not making myself smaller to manage everyone else's comfort. I've spent 15 years being treated as less than Jessica, having my achievements ignored or dismissed, being pushed to the margins of this family you built with Richard. I'm done. I could see tears starting in her eyes, but for the first time in my life, I didn't move to comfort her, didn't rush to fix her distress at the expense of my own truth. Jessica had materialized from somewhere, drawn by the tension, or perhaps by some instinct that the attention had shifted away from her, and she snapped with that particular tone of aggrieved entitlement she'd cultivated since childhood. This is so typical, making everything about you. Mom comes all the way to Chicago to support you, and you're attacking her. I turned to Jessica then, really looked at her, this woman who had been given everything and appreciated nothing, who had been centered in every family narrative while I was relegated to footnotes, and I spoke to her directly for perhaps the first time with complete honesty. Jessica, I have never competed with you. You were given every advantage, every benefit of the doubt, every ounce of attention and celebration and support. I'm not angry at you for receiving those things. I'm angry at them for making love conditional and unequal, for deciding that one daughter deserved everything, while the other should be grateful for scraps. Jessica's face crumpled in a way I'd never seen before, something between anger and comprehension flickering in her eyes. But before she could respond, Aunt Carol materialized at my side, with Sarah and Marcus close behind, forming a protective circle that made the power dynamics in that elegant reception room suddenly visible to everyone watching, and Carol said firmly, "Emma's right, and it's long past time someone said it," her voice carrying the authority of someone who had watched this injustice unfold for 15 years and finally had permission to speak the truth. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, this woman who had given birth to me and raised me for 13 years before deciding that her new husband's comfort mattered more than her daughter's dignity. And I said what I'd needed to say, since I was a confused 13-year-old trying to understand why suddenly I wasn't enough anymore. I'm moving to Chicago. I'm starting a partnership that will let me do the work I love with people who actually value me. I won't be coming back for holidays or family events where I'm tolerated rather than celebrated. If you want a relationship with me, it needs to be rebuilt on mutual respect, not obligation. Linda was crying now, mascara starting to run, her hands reaching toward me in that pleading gesture that had always made me fold before, and she said, "Emma, you're my daughter. I love you." But the words that had once held power over me now sounded hollow because I'd finally learned that love wasn't just a word you said, but a choice you made every day, and she had chosen differently for 15 years. "Then you should have acted like it," I said gently, not with anger, but with the kind of sad clarity that comes when you finally see the truth you've been avoiding. You chose Richard's comfort over my dignity, again and again. You stood by while he treated me as less than Jessica, while he made it clear I wasn't really family, while he pushed me to the margins of every celebration and dismissed every achievement. Maybe someday we can repair this, but right now, I need distance to heal from what you allowed to happen to me. Richard tried to step forward then, perhaps finally understanding that there were consequences to 15 years of casual cruelty, and he said, "Emma, I'm sorry. I never meant—" But I held up my hand because I'd heard enough insincere apologies in my life to recognize another one, and I said, "You meant it every time. You meant it when you left my high school graduation early, when you dismissed my career as a hobby, when you physically pushed me out of a chair 3 weeks ago. You don't get to unmean it now that you've realized I'm more successful than you thought." I turned away from them then, turned back to Marcus and Sarah and Carol, and the San Francisco partner who was looking at me with new respect, turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Michigan Avenue and the city that would become my home. And I walked away from my mother and Richard and Jessica without looking back because I'd spent enough of my life looking over my shoulder, hoping they'd finally see me. 3 months later, I stood in my new office on the 17th floor of Westfield and Associates, the brass nameplate on my door reading Emma Torres, partner, catching the late March sunlight, and I reviewed preliminary designs for a mixed-use development in Seattle that would incorporate even more innovative, sustainable features than Verde Heights had. My team of 4 junior architects working in the connected conference room on renderings that would blow the client's mind when we presented next week. My phone buzzed with a text from Carol confirming our dinner reservation for 7 o'clock at the Italian place near her hotel. Her third visit to Chicago since I'd moved, our relationship deepening now that it wasn't filtered through the toxic dynamics of family gatherings where Linda's choices had poisoned every interaction. There was an unread voicemail from Linda, the 7th she'd left in 3 months, and I looked at it without the automatic guilt that used to flood my system whenever I considered not immediately responding to my mother's needs. I wasn't ready yet to hear what she had to say. Wasn't ready to open that door before I'd finished building the foundation of self-worth that would let me interact with her from a place of strength rather than that old desperate hunger for her approval. Maybe in a few more months I'd listen to those messages. Maybe eventually we'd have the difficult conversations that might lead to some kind of rebuilt relationship based on mutual respect rather than my acceptance of mistreatment. But right now, in this moment, I was exactly where I needed to be. I looked out at the Chicago skyline stretching toward Lake Michigan, at the city I'd chosen, and that had chosen me back. And I thought about that Christmas dinner when Richard had pushed me out of my chair and told me it was for his real daughter. How that moment of cruelty had been the catalyst that finally broke my pattern of making myself small to fit into their narrow definition of family. I'd spent so many years believing that if I was just patient enough, understanding enough, undemanding enough, they would eventually see my worth and love me the way they loved Jessica. But I'd been operating on a flawed premise because the problem was never my worth, but their willingness to recognize it. The award on my bookshelf caught the light, crystal and solid, and engraved with proof that I was exactly as capable and visionary as I'd always secretly believed. And I didn't need them to see my value anymore, because I saw it myself. And that was always enough, had always been enough, would always be enough regardless of who else understood it, or celebrated it, or acknowledged it. I was 31 years old, and I was a partner in one of the most respected sustainable architecture firms in the country, and I was working on projects that would help build a better future, and I was surrounded by people who valued me, and I had finally chosen myself after 3 decades of waiting for others to choose me first. The distance from that Christmas dinner to this Chicago office wasn't measured in miles or months, but in the internal journey from seeking validation to knowing my own worth. And standing there looking out at my new city, I felt something I'd been chasing my whole life without quite knowing what I was seeking: peace.